They built no stone cities. Their empire was not measured in static walls, but in the rapid deployment of force and the efficient harvesting of Spanish resources. They were the apex predators of the plains. If you look at the map of North America in the 18th century, you will see the heavy, rigid lines of European ambition. The Spanish crown was obsessed with weight. They dragged limestone and timber across the unforgiving deserts of Nuevo Mexico and Tejas to build massive presidios and towering missions. They believed that power was derived from mass. They believed that if you anchored yourself to the earth with enough stone, you could tame the wilderness. They were catastrophically wrong. While the Spanish were sweating and dying to build forts that couldn't move, a group of Shoshonean hunter-gatherers descended from the Rocky Mountains and performed a total systemic override of the Great Plains. They were the Nʉmʉnʉ, the Comanche. They looked at the heavy, static world of the Europeans and realized a fundamental truth of the American interior. Weight is a liability. They did not want to conquer the earth. They wanted to skim across it. By integrating an abandoned European technology, the horse, into their daily existence, the Comanche broke the ancient rules of survival. They created a civilization composed entirely of motion. They were a decentralized, high-speed logistical network that treated the rigid Spanish Empire as a self-stocking grocery store and the surrounding indigenous tribes as raw material. Today, we are conducting a deep, clinical examination of the Comanche machine. We are stripping away the sanitized myths to witness the raw, mechanical genius of the only true equestrian empire in North America. We are going to see how they mastered terrain bypass to render borders meaningless, how they utilized mobile procurement to tax an entire continent, and, crucially, the hidden fragility that made their engines so vulnerable. This is the story of what happens when a people decide to weaponize the wind. To comprehend the sheer scale of the Comanche ascension, you must first look at the harsh physics of the Great Plains before the year 1680. For thousands of years, the human experience on the southern plains was defined by crushing friction. The landscape, particularly the vast, waterless expanse of the Llano Estacado, the staked plains, was a lethal environment for a creature walking on two legs. The energy cost to cross this ocean of grass was immense. A human hunter on foot operated on a razor-thin caloric margin. You tracked a bison for days, burning massive amounts of energy, hoping the kill would yield enough protein to replace what you had just spent. It was an economy of absolute scarcity. You were chained to the riverbeds, unable to project power or accumulate wealth. Then came the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. The indigenous people of New Mexico violently expelled the Spanish, and in the chaos, thousands of Spanish horses were released into the wild. When the Comanche encountered the horse, they did not just see a beast of burden. They recognized it as a living refinery. The horse possesses a digestive tract capable of breaking down cellulose, the tough, fibrous prairie grass that is completely indigestible and useless to a human stomach. The horse takes that infinite sea of useless grass and converts it into high-octane kinetic energy. By mastering the horse, the Comanche executed a total upgrade of their civilization. They bypassed the human limitations of endurance and speed. Suddenly, the unusable wasteland of the Llano Estacado became the richest energy source on the planet. The Comanche transformed from a marginal band of mountain foragers into a high-performance equestrian elite. They moved down onto the southern plains because that was where the fuel was. While other tribes kept small herds for occasional hunting, the Comanche completely restructured their society around the animal. They became a mounted economy of surplus. They bred, stole, and traded horses until they possessed herds numbering in the tens of thousands. They moved their camps with the seasons, chasing the best grass to ensure their organic engines were always fueled. This mastery granted them their first great strategic advantage: terrain bypass. The Spanish military was chained to supply lines and roads. The Comanche were not. A Comanche war party could cross hundreds of miles of barren, waterless desert that European maps marked as impassable. They carried water in the intestines of bison, drank the blood of their horses if necessary, and emerged from the empty spaces to strike deep behind enemy lines. The Spanish built walls to block the roads, but the Comanche simply went around them. The environment was their highway, and no static empire could police it. Because the Comanche were entirely mobile, they had zero interest in the traditional metrics of statecraft. States are heavy. States require agriculture, which ties you to a single plot of dirt. States have cities, which serve as fixed points of failure that enemies can besiege or burn. The Comanche recognized that if you remain in constant motion, you are effectively untouchable. They looked at the Spanish settlements in New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico not as rival sovereign territories, but as living warehouses. The Spanish were doing the brutal, back-breaking labor of digging wells, planting corn, and raising cattle and sheep. The Comanche saw no reason to replicate this labor. Why farm when you can simply harvest the farmers? This was the doctrine of mobile procurement. The Comanche established an annual rhythm of extraction. Every autumn, under the bright, guiding light of the Comanche moon, hundreds of warriors would ride south. They would bypass the heavy stone presidios entirely, slipping through the gaps in the Spanish defensive network to strike the sprawling haciendas and ranches of Chihuahua and Coahuila with surgical precision. Their objective was extraction. They would kill the men who resisted, burn the static infrastructure, and round up thousands of horses, mules, and cattle. By the time the Spanish garrison managed to saddle their mounts, the Comanche were already 50 miles away, driving their newly acquired assets back into the impenetrable depths of the Comancheria. But livestock was only half of the harvest. The Comanche also extracted human capital. A nomadic warrior society comes with a high mortality rate. To sustain their empire, the Comanche required a constant influx of fresh genetic material and labor. They solved this through the mass kidnapping of Spanish and Mexican women and children. These captives were processed through a brutal psychological crucible designed to erase their previous identity and integrate them into the Comanche machine. A Mexican boy captured at the age of 8 would be subjected to severe discipline, taught the Comanche language, and trained to ride and shoot. By 18, the boy who used to go to Mass in San Antonio was now a Comanche warrior, fully integrated, participating in raids against his former people. This demographic recycling program was ruthlessly efficient, allowing the Comanche to constantly replenish their ranks. By the mid-1700s, the Spanish authorities were effectively paying the Comanche protection money in the form of regular tributes, guns, lead, sugar, and cloth, just to keep the raiding parties away. The supposedly primitive nomads were taxing the most powerful maritime empire on Earth. To enforce this system of taxation and terror, the Comanche developed a method of warfare that rendered traditional European military tactics completely obsolete. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European and American forces relied on the line of battle. A dragoon would ride to the battlefield, dismount, stand shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, and fire a single-shot, muzzle-loading musket. It was a slow, rigid form of violence. The Comanche operated as a fluid, high-speed weapons platform. They delivered a kinetic payload that relied on overwhelming velocity and volume of fire. A Comanche warrior was physically integrated with the animal. Boys were taught to ride bareback, guiding the horse with their knees and shifting weight, leaving both hands entirely free. They perfected a maneuver where, at a full gallop, the warrior would hook his heel over the horse's spine and drop his body down the side of the animal. From the perspective of an enemy soldier, the Comanche rider simply disappeared. The horse became a moving shield of meat and bone. From under the neck of the galloping horse, the warrior would unleash his payload. The primary weapon was not the clumsy, slow-loading musket, but the short bow, engineered from Osage orangewood or bighorn sheephorn and backed with animal sinew. These bows boasted a draw weight of up to 70 pounds. The physics were devastating. You have a warrior moving at 35 miles per hour firing a heavy, iron-tipped arrow. The kinetic force of the galloping horse is added directly to the force of the bowstring. The resulting impact could drive an arrow completely through a massive bison's ribcage, or punch straight through the thick leather armor of a Spanish dragoon. The rate of fire was unmatched. A skilled Comanche could fire 20 arrows accurately in the time it took a Spanish soldier to bite open a paper cartridge, pour powder, ram a lead ball home, and fire a single, inaccurate musket shot. They utilized the Comanche circle. A war party would ride in a continuous, swirling vortex around a trapped enemy. This revolving wheel of dust and flying arrows meant the enemy never had a stationary target to aim at. The Comanche would bleed a static formation to death without ever engaging in prolonged hand-to-hand combat. If the enemy counterattacked, the Comanche evaporated, melting into the horizon only to regroup 20 miles away. They weaponized space and speed, ensuring every engagement was fought on their terms. Because we are accustomed to looking for governments in buildings, it is easy to mistake the Comanche for isolated bands of raiders. In reality, they operated as the central hub of a highly organized continental trade syndicate. They were the apex managers of the North American interior. They understood macroeconomics. They recognized that the horse was a fluctuating currency. In the Spanish provinces of the South, where horses were bred and easily stolen, they were cheap. But hundreds of miles north, among the agricultural tribes and the freezing plains of Canada, horses were incredibly rare and highly valued. The Comanche exploited this geographic arbitrage. They utilized their mobile procurement network to harvest thousands of horses from Mexico, then drove these massive herds north, trading them to the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the French. In exchange, the Comanche received British and French manufactured goods, steel knives, copper kettles, and most importantly, firearms and powder. They acted as a massive armed conveyor belt, moving the resources of the South to the North and the technology of the North to the South. To protect this monopoly, they engaged in a ruthless campaign of geopolitical clearing. Before the Comanche arrived, the southern plains were heavily populated by the Apache. The Comanche systematically hunted the Apache, burning their camps and driving the survivors off the prime bison hunting grounds and into the harsh mountains of the desert Southwest. The Comanche created a massive, exclusive buffer zone. They controlled the river crossings and monitored the mountain passes. If you were a French trader or a Spanish priest, you did not cross the Comancheria without their permission. They dictated the terms of trade, deciding who received horses and who received arrows. They were administrating a commercial empire. But every high-performance engine possesses a fatal flaw. We look at the sheer reach of the Comanche and assume invincibility. Yet their empire was built on a razor-thin margin of ecological and industrial dependency. They were an apex predator that could not manufacture its own teeth. Their greatest strength, the horse, was also their most crippling vulnerability. A single Comanche warrior did not just ride one horse. He required a remuda of 5 to 10 mounts to maintain his incredible mobility. Scaled up to an empire, you are looking at herds totaling over 200,000 equines. The logistical nightmare of sustaining that kind of biomass is staggering. Horses require massive amounts of water and grass. During the brutal southwestern droughts, or the freezing dead of winter, the Comanche were forced to retreat into the river valleys. 200,000 horses concentrated in narrow riverbeds would literally eat the valleys down to the dirt, destroying the very ecosystem that kept them alive. The Comanche were trapped by their own engines. They had to keep expanding and moving, because standing still meant their herds would starve. Furthermore, their technological supremacy was an illusion built on foreign supply chains. By the mid-19th century, the Comanche relied heavily on firearms to maintain their dominance. But a rifle without gunpowder is just a clumsy wooden club. The Comanche did not forge iron or mill sulfur. They relied entirely on the New Mexican traders and European smugglers for every single grain of powder and ounce of lead they fired. If that supply chain was severed, their kinetic payload would evaporate. They were the undisputed masters of the plains, yet they lived in absolute reliance on the industrial furnaces of the very civilizations they raided. The Comanche machine was terrifyingly fast, but it was incredibly brittle. All it took to shatter it was an opponent willing to target the fuel instead of the rider. An empire built on pure motion is invincible until you drain the tank. For generations, the Spanish and Mexican armies had tried to defeat the Comanche using conventional military strategies and failed. The United States Army initially made the same mistake, sending heavy cavalry out onto the staked plains. The Comanche simply used terrain bypass to ride circles around the frustrated, dehydrated American columns. You cannot shoot what you cannot catch. But in the post-Civil War era, the United States changed its strategy. The generals realized they were fighting an ecological war. If they could not destroy the machine in the field, they had to liquidate its resources. The energy that sustained the Comanche Empire was not just the grass, it was the American bison. The bison provided the protein that kept the warriors strong, the sinew that backed their bows, the hides that formed their mobile teepees, and the robes they used to trade for ammunition. In the 1870s, the U.S. government unofficially sanctioned the industrial slaughter of the buffalo herds. It was a calculated act of systemic starvation. Thousands of commercial hunters flooded the plains, equipped with heavy-caliber Sharps rifles. They shot the animals from a distance, stripped the hides for East Coast factories, and left millions of tons of meat to rot in the sun. Within a few short years, the herds that once darkened the horizon were gone. The prairie was silent, covered only in a carpet of bleaching white bones. The Comanche's caloric balance hit absolute zero. Simultaneously, the technological gap closed. The invention of the repeating rifle and the Colt revolver meant that a U.S. cavalryman no longer needed to stop and reload a single-shot weapon. He could now unleash a volume of fire that rivaled the Comanche bow, neutralizing the advantage of the Centaur Doctrine. The final, fatal blow to the Comanche machine did not occur in a grand battle. It was a cold, clinical, logistical strike. In September 1874, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie tracked a large coalition of Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne to their hidden winter sanctuary deep within the Palo Duro Canyon in the Texas Panhandle. Mackenzie's troops launched a surprise attack at dawn. The Comanche warriors fought fiercely to cover the retreat of their families up the steep canyon walls. But Mackenzie was not interested in a body count. He was interested in the engine. While the warriors retreated, the U.S. cavalry captured the Comanche herd, over 1,400 horses. Mackenzie understood that if he simply took the horses, the Comanche would steal them back. He made a decision that broke the spine of the empire. He ordered his men to herd the horses into Tool Canyon. There, the soldiers formed firing squads and systematically shot all but 400 animals. The canyon ran red with blood, and the deafening echo of gunfire lasted for hours. When the smoke cleared, the Comanche were no longer the masters of velocity. They had been forcibly disconnected from their organic engines. They were, for the first time in a century, pedestrians. Without their horses, there could be no kinetic payload. Without the speed, there could be no mobile procurement. Without the bison, there was no food. The freezing winter of 1874 set in, and the greatest empire of the plains, starving and shivering on foot, was forced to walk out of the canyons and surrender to the reservation at Fort Sill. We have a tendency to look back at the history of the frontier and filter it through a lens of melancholic tragedy. We romanticize the feathers, the war paint, and the noble defeat. But to view the Comanche merely as tragic victims is a profound insult to what they actually achieved. They were a high-performance society that engineered an empire of terror, trade, and absolute dominance. They demonstrated what happens when a people abandons the illusion of safety provided by walls and embraces the pure, unadulterated power of motion. They proved that a civilization does not need to build stone monuments to be a superpower. It only needs enough velocity to outrun the enemy and enough ruthlessness to harvest the weak. For 150 years, they turned the center of the North American continent into their own private domain. They were the apex predators of a world where the only laws were the speed of your horse, the tension of your bowstring, and the cold calculation of how many calories you could extract from the ground beneath your hooves. The frontier did not conquer the Comanche. The Comanche owned the frontier. It was only when the industrial might of a continent-spanning nation physically destroyed the ecosystem itself that the machine finally stopped. The next time you find yourself driving across the seemingly empty expanse of the Texas Panhandle, roll down the window. Listen to the wind howling across the grass. Remember that you are not looking at an empty space. You are standing in the graveyard of motion. You are looking at the ruins of an empire that was simply too fast, too fluid, and too brilliant to ever be caught in stone. The price of that power was a life lived at a dead sprint, a bow always strung, and a clinical understanding that in the desert, you are either the engine or you are the fuel.